Rejected by elite program. Janitor's 15-year-old daughter builds DIY rocket. NASA comes calling. She was just a janitor's daughter from a forgotten town. But at 16, Kayla Morgan built a rocket from scrap metal and made the world look up. Rejected by elite programs, doubted by classmates, and battling the pain of losing her father, Kayla refused to give up. What she did next caught NASA's attention and changed her life forever. This is not just a story about science. It's a story about grit, loss, and a dream that wouldn't stay grounded. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire the soul and defy the odds. At 15 years old, Kayla Morgan was already different from everyone else in Willow Creek. In a town of barely 2,000 people, where the biggest ambition most kids had was to work at the local hardware store or marry into one of the wealthier families on the hill, Kayla dreamed of outer space. Not in the vague, childish way that kids talk about being an astronaut one day, but with the kind of razor-sharp focus that made her spend hours sketching propulsion diagrams on napkins and calculating thrust ratios on the back of old receipts. She didn't just dream of space. She studied it like it was a subject that could save her life. Her fascination had begun early, long before she could understand the mechanics of lift or fuel pressure. On her 7th birthday, her father, David Morgan, a janitor at the local high school, had driven her to the Science Museum in Nashville. They couldn't afford much. A day trip like that meant going without new shoes or skipping groceries for the week, but David had made it happen anyway. Kayla had stood under the giant replica of the Apollo 11 module, eyes wide with wonder, and something inside her had clicked. From that moment on, she wasn't just a girl from a broken-down farmhouse on the edge of town. She was a future rocket engineer. Her room, if you could call the creaky attic with a skylight a room, was plastered with cutouts from old science magazines, hand-drawn blueprints, and printouts from the school library. Every night she'd lie on her narrow mattress, watching the stars through the dusty glass above her, whispering the names of constellations like prayers. Orion, Cassiopeia, Lyra. They weren't just distant lights to her, they were destinations. Her dad watched all of this with a mix of pride and helplessness. He worked long hours scrubbing floors and fixing broken lockers, coming home with calloused hands and grease-stained clothes. Since Kayla's mother died of cancer when Kayla was 9, he'd carried the weight of both parenthood and survival on his hunched shoulders. But no matter how exhausted he was, he never discouraged her. Sometimes after dinner she'd find him sitting on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring up at the sky with her. He didn't know much about stars, but he knew how to listen. One chilly October morning, Kayla arrived at school to find a flyer pinned to the bulletin board outside the science lab. Young Aerospace Innovators, Summer Engineering Program for Future Rocket Scientists. Her heart skipped. The flyer promised mentorship from NASA engineers, hands-on workshops, and, best of all, full scholarships for accepted students. She tore it down, clutching it like it was a ticket to another world. That night, after Riley, her 13-year-old brother, had gone to bed, Kayla sat at the kitchen table under the flickering overhead bulb and began drafting her application essay. Riley had muscular dystrophy, which kept him in a wheelchair most days, but his brain worked faster than most adults she knew. He rolled into the kitchen with a blanket over his legs and asked, "You're applying, right?" She smiled and nodded. "Of course. I mean, someone's got to get us off this rock." The essay took her 4 nights to write. She poured her heart into it, describing how she'd learned to disassemble old lawnmower engines, how she'd built a rudimentary thrust chamber from a hairdryer and PVC pipes, and how her dream wasn't just to fly, but to design the vessels that would carry humanity to new frontiers. She included pictures of her small prototypes, hand-drawn blueprints, and even a short video Riley helped her film where she explained the basics of Newton's third law using a shopping cart and fire extinguishers. Her dad couldn't afford postage, so he walked 4 miles to the next town just to mail it at the official post office. "They say it gets there faster this way," he told her, handing her the receipt. Kayla hugged him tightly, her fingers trembling. For once it felt like something real might come of her dreams. Days passed, then weeks. She checked the mailbox every day after school, even on Sundays when she knew there'd be nothing. Finally, one afternoon, she spotted a thin envelope addressed in sleek black type. She froze. Her name. The program's logo in the corner. Her hands shook as she tore it open. "We regret to inform you." The words burned. Her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the porch steps, the letter fluttering from her fingers like an injured bird. She didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, staring into the distance as her world quietly unraveled. Her father came home half an hour later and found her there. He didn't say a word. Just sat beside her, his large, rough hand covering hers. "They're wrong, you know," he finally said. She wanted to believe him, but something inside her had cracked. She'd given them everything, her dreams, her work, her story, and it wasn't enough. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, she stared at the rejection letter, illuminated by a flickering desk lamp. Then she flipped to a blank page in her journal and wrote a single sentence at the top in bold, angry print. "If they won't let me learn there, I'll learn here." The next morning, she walked to the junkyard on the edge of town. It was a sprawling maze of rusted-out cars, fridges, and broken electronics. The owner, a bearded man named Pete, who smelled like motor oil and beef jerky, raised an eyebrow as Kayla began sorting through old brake lines and exhaust tubing. "What's this for?" he asked, wiping grease on his overalls. "I'm going to build a rocket," she said simply. He chuckled, but didn't laugh at her. "Well, just don't blow up my yard." "Deal," she said, grinning. She walked home with her backpack full of scrap, her fingers sore and clothes streaked with grime. But, inside her, something had reignited. In the back of their house stood a warped old barn, long unused except for storing broken lawn furniture and moldy paint cans. She kicked the door open and declared it her new headquarters. She worked in secret at first. After school, she'd grab a granola bar, kiss Riley on the head, and vanish into the barn. She cleared out space, set up makeshift shelves using old crates, and hung a whiteboard she found in the school dumpster. It smelled like hay and old metal, but to her it was a lab. At night, her father would sometimes bring her tea and quietly watch her through the doorway. He didn't ask too many questions, just made sure she had enough light and wasn't cutting herself on jagged metal. One evening, as she sat hunched over a pile of wiring, he asked softly, "You sure about this?" She looked up at him, her face smudged with soot, eyes blazing. "I have to be. I'm tired of waiting for someone else to say yes." He didn't argue, just nodded and handed her a flashlight. "Then make it count." Her first few prototypes were disasters. The engines sputtered, the wiring shorted, the combustion chamber melted. She burned herself twice and accidentally set a patch of grass on fire. But each failure taught her something, and every time she fell, she got back up. By the end of that month, Kayla had something that looked vaguely like a missile. Slim, metallic, with stabilizing fins cut from scrap aluminum. Riley helped her test the guidance calculations. She soldered circuits by flashlight and learned to weld using tutorials on a second-hand tablet. She hadn't been accepted to that fancy summer program, but she was already building her future, one wire, one weld, one wild, impossible dream at a time. And somewhere, deep in the folds of the universe, the stars watched silently. Waiting. The next morning, Kayla woke up before the sun. The house was still. Riley snored softly from the next room, and the floorboards creaked only under her own weight as she tiptoed to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of orange juice, stale and nearly expired, then made her way out to the barn, a notebook tucked under her arm and a pencil clenched between her teeth. The barn was cold, smelling of rust and damp wood, but it was hers. She'd taped posters of famous space missions to the warped walls: Apollo 11, Voyager, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, smeared slightly from the condensation. In the corner stood what she proudly called Mark I, her first-ever rocket frame. It was a Frankenstein's monster of parts. copper piping from an old dishwasher, aluminum tubes from a junked bicycle frame, and wiring stripped from broken microwaves. Every piece had a story. Every weld, a scar from trial and error. She flipped open her notebook, where she'd diagrammed a new engine design. Her last prototype had failed to ignite properly. The fuel mixture was off, and the chamber had cracked under pressure. But she'd learned. Liquid alcohol would burn more evenly if she narrowed the injector nozzle. She jotted down more notes and began pulling parts from the bin she labeled, "Maybe useful someday." For hours, she worked in silence, the only sounds being the rasp of metal against metal and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. She lost track of time until a voice called from the doorway. "You know you're supposed to eat breakfast like a normal human, right?" Kayla turned to see Riley wheeling himself in, a bowl of cereal balanced expertly on his lap. His face was pale in the morning light, his legs wrapped in thermal blankets, but his eyes sparkled. "I was thinking about combustion," Kayla replied without missing a beat. "How fuel disperses through different nozzle geometries. I might need your brain again." Riley rolled his eyes, grinning. "That's what I'm here for." He stayed beside her for an hour, running equations on the tablet and offering insights she hadn't considered. He was too smart for most schoolwork, but when it came to physics, he thrived. Kayla leaned over his shoulder as he ran a simulation of the fuel burn rate across varying pressure gradients. "This," she murmured, "this is the good stuff." Later that week, she went back to Pete's junkyard. He greeted her with a wave and a smile. "Back again, Rocket Girl?" Kayla grinned. "I need sheet metal, old tubing, and maybe a small pressure valve?" Pete scratched his beard. "I think I've got just the thing. Don't tell the fire marshal." He led her to a corner where an old water heater lay rusting. "That valve might still be good. You'll need to clean it up, though." She thanked him and spent the next 2 hours picking through the wreckage, her hands black with grease and rust. People drove by, slowing to stare, but she didn't care. They didn't see what she saw, the potential in every discarded thing. When she returned home, her dad was waiting on the porch. "You're going to get tetanus one of these days," he said, trying to sound stern. But Kayla saw the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't angry. He was just worried. "I'm careful," she said, dropping the backpack full of parts onto the steps with a loud clank. "Mostly." He sighed and opened the front door. "Wash up. Dinner's in 10. They ate quietly that night. Spaghetti from a can heated on the stove. Riley talked about his science teacher, Ms. Blake, who was teaching Newton's laws, which he already knew by heart. Kayla listened, but her mind was half in the barn. She couldn't stop thinking about the new design. After dinner, her father pulled her aside. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said, lowering himself into the threadbare armchair, "about this rocket thing." Her stomach tightened. She braced herself for disappointment, for you need to focus on real life. Instead, he surprised her. "I know I can't help much," he began, "but I want you to be safe, and I want you to keep going. You remind me so much of your mom when you get like this, like something's chasing you and you can't stop till you catch it." Kayla felt her throat tighten. She hadn't heard him talk about her mom in weeks. "She would have been proud," he said, then paused. "I am too." She nodded, too choked up to speak. After a moment, she returned to the barn, but her hands shook as she picked up the soldering iron. Pride was a heavy thing when it came from someone who had nothing else to give. The next few days passed in a blur of experimentation. She mounted a new test stand using cinder blocks and rebar, built a pressure-controlled ignition system, and set up a fuel chamber lined with insulating tape. She'd learned from every mistake, kept a journal of every success and failure, and by the end of the week she had a prototype that was sleek, aerodynamic, and, most importantly, stable. She named it Nova. But things weren't all progress and pride. At school, the whispers started. "Did you hear? Kayla's building a rocket. Like a real one." Some said it with awe, others with mockery. One day in the hallway, a senior girl sneered, "So, when are you going to launch yourself out of this dump? You know, before you blow yourself up?" Kayla didn't answer. She just walked past. But the words stuck. She was used to being the quiet girl, the weird one with oil stains on her jeans and circuits in her backpack. But now, the attention felt different. Sharper. Crueler. That night, she came home to find the barn's side door open. Her stomach dropped. Inside, her workbench was overturned, papers scattered, her toolbox emptied onto the floor. Her blueprints were torn. Her heart pounded as she ran to check on Nova, still standing, thankfully untouched, but everything else looked like a hurricane had ripped through. She dropped to her knees, hands shaking. Someone had done this, on purpose. When her father saw the damage, his face darkened. "I'll find out who did this." "No," Kayla said, voice tight. "Don't. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." But Kayla was already picking up the torn pages. Some were salvageable. Others she'd have to redo. It was infuriating, devastating. But it wouldn't stop her. Later that evening, she sat in the barn, the tools reorganized, blueprints taped back together. She stared at Nova. "You're going to fly," she whispered, "even if I have to rebuild you from scratch." The next day, Ms. Teresa Blake called her aside after physics class. She was a soft-spoken woman with a permanent smudge of chalk on her slacks and the kind of eyes that saw more than they let on. "I heard what happened," she said. "In the barn." Kayla stiffened. "I'm fine." "You're not, but you will be." There was a long pause, and then Ms. Blake said, "Come by after school. I want to show you something." Kayla hesitated, then nodded. That afternoon, she found herself standing in Ms. Blake's tiny office behind the lab room. The shelves were crammed with old books, broken calculators, and a dusty telescope. "I wasn't always a teacher," Ms. Blake said, opening a drawer. She pulled out a photo. Her, younger, standing beside a launch pad with a group of engineers. "I worked at NASA for 8 years." Kayla stared. "You?" Missy Blake smiled faintly. "I was part of a propulsion development team. We designed fuel delivery systems for low Earth orbit missions." "Why? Did you leave?" Her smile faded. "There was an accident, a miscalculation in the pressure valve. A colleague of mine got hurt, badly. I blamed myself, even if the review board didn't. I left. I thought teaching would be safer." Kayla said nothing. She understood. Failure could be suffocating. "I'm telling you this because I see you," Ms. Blake continued. "I see your drive, your fire, and I want to help, if you'll let me." Kayla stared at the woman, the offer dangling between them like a lifeline. Then she nodded. "I'd like that, Ms." Blake handed her a folder. Engineering notes, diagrams, equations. Real NASA stuff. "Let's make sure your next test doesn't explode," she said with a grin. For the first time in days, Kayla laughed. She left the office that evening with a heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Yes, she'd been rejected. Yes, her work had been sabotaged. But now, she had a mentor, a guide, someone who'd been to the stars and come back with scars. And maybe, just maybe, she could follow those same stars, on her own terms. The following Saturday morning, rain whispered against the barn's tin roof as Kayla stood over her disassembled fuel chamber, fingers black with soot and a gash across her knuckle. The cold metal bit into her skin, but she didn't care. She was troubleshooting again. The second test had failed, and this time the ignition was delayed, causing the flame to flare sideways and nearly singe her workbench. She was lucky it hadn't hit her. Lucky. That's what she kept telling herself. But inside, doubt had begun to snake through the cracks of her determination. What if she really didn't know enough? What if all this effort was just naive? She didn't want to admit it, but her hands had trembled when she held the blowtorch earlier. For the first time since starting her project, she felt small, like someone pretending to be part of a world that had no place for her. That afternoon, Miss Blake showed up unannounced, a steaming thermos in one hand and a long cardboard box under the other. "Thought you could use a real cup of coffee," she said, setting the thermos on the table. "And maybe this." Kayla wiped her hands and watched curiously as Miss Blake opened the box. Inside were 3 large spiral-bound volumes, yellowed but intact. Old university propulsion textbooks, Ms. Blake explained. Most people would call them outdated, but physics hasn't changed much, and neither has combustion theory. Kayla ran her fingers across the covers as if they were sacred. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Blake hesitated, then pulled up a stool. "Because once, someone gave me a chance, and I wasted it. I want to help someone who might actually do something with theirs." The words hung in the air like steam rising from the mug. Kayla didn't press. She could see it in Ms. Blake's eyes. There was pain in her past, some deep professional wound she hadn't spoken of. But she could also see something else now, hope in her. For the next few weeks, they worked together every other day after school. Ms. Blake brought books, notes, and printed schematics she'd collected over the years. Kayla devoured them, cross-referencing the diagrams with her own build, modifying her fuel intake angles, reshaping her nozzle cones, recalibrating for heat expansion. They argued sometimes. Kayla was stubborn, fiercely so, and Ms. Blake wasn't used to teaching someone so hands-on. One afternoon, they spent nearly an hour debating chamber insulation before Kayla huffed and walked out of the barn, only to return 10 minutes later, quietly holding the correct formula. "You were right," she mumbled. "I usually am." Ms. Blake replied with a smirk, handing her a granola bar as a peace offering. But progress wasn't just mechanical. Word of Kayla's project had spread further than she wanted. A sophomore named Jared had taken a blurry photo of her rocket frame and posted it online with the caption, "Our school has its own mad scientist. Should we be worried?" The comments had come fast. Some amused, some nasty. "She's gonna blow up the town. Is this legal? She thinks she's Elon Musk's daughter or something." Kayla tried to ignore it, but the whispers at school became harder to drown out. People stared more. Teachers watched her closely, not always with support. Even Riley told her that some students were joking about her during lunch. "You okay with this?" he asked her one evening as she bolted a stabilizer fin into place. "Let them laugh," Kayla said. "They won't be laughing when it flies." But she wasn't made of steel. One afternoon, walking home, she found spray paint across the barn side. "Stay grounded, Space Girl." She stood there for a long moment, the red dripping down like blood from the letters. Then she went inside, picked up a brush, and painted over it. Not just with white paint, but with stars. She covered the entire wall in constellations. Orion, Cassiopeia, Lyra, her sky, her defiance. It wasn't long before her resolve was tested again. 3 nights later, she'd just finished wiring her ignition controller when she heard a noise outside. Footsteps. Not her father's. She froze. The barn door creaked open. In stepped her dad, but behind him was someone else. "Evening, Kayla," said a familiar voice. She turned and saw Mr. Warner, the school's vice principal. A tall, stiff man who always seemed to be judging everything with his thin lips and squinting eyes. "I heard from a few concerned parents," he said, "that you're experimenting with explosives." Kayla bristled. "It's a rocket, and it's not explosive, at least not if handled properly." "Be that as it may," he continued, glancing around at the hanging tools and engine parts. "I must ask, are you licensed? Do you have adult supervision?" "She does," her dad cut in. "Me. And Miss Blake's been helping her too." Mr. Warner didn't look convinced. "I just want to remind you," he said, stepping closer to the rocket frame, "that your school's reputation is at stake. If something were to go wrong—" "It won't," Kayla snapped, stepping between him and Nova. "Because I know what I'm doing." Mr. Warner gave a tight smile. "Let's hope so." He left, his polished shoes clicking across the dirt path like punctuation. The silence he left behind felt heavier than anything she'd soldered together. Her dad placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" "No," she whispered, "but I will be." Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the barn, staring at the exposed circuitry of the ignition box. She had rewired it 3 times, each time cleaner than the last. But now her hands hovered, unsure. What if they shut her down? What if the test failed again? What if everyone was right? She didn't hear Ms. Blake come in until a small thunk echoed behind her. A sandwich, wrapped in foil, still warm. "Your dad said you skipped dinner," Ms. Blake said softly. Kayla didn't answer. "I saw the wall," she added. "Nice constellations." Kayla gave a small smile, then went back to soldering. After a few minutes, Ms. Blake said, "You know, I left NASA because of a mistake. I overpressurized a tank, didn't double-check the readouts. It ruptured. No one died, but someone got hurt. Badly. I couldn't handle the guilt. So I ran. Taught middle school physics to stay useful." Kayla turned slowly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not me. You double-check everything. You question your own calculations. That makes you safer than I ever was." Kayla swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You're scared. That's normal," Ms. Blake said, "but don't let their fear become your limit." Something clicked inside Kayla. Not mechanical, emotional. The gears of her doubt slowed, realigned. The next morning, she walked into school with oil stains on her hands and her head held high. She didn't flinch when Jared whispered something. She didn't react when the girl from the hallway giggled. She walked straight to the physics lab, dropped her blueprints on Ms. Blake's desk, and said, "I'm ready to test again." Over the next 10 days, Nova evolved. Kayla installed a rudimentary telemetry sensor made from a hacked drone chip. She used dry ice to simulate pressure changes. She ran flame tests behind a concrete shield, each time recording the arc, speed, and combustion duration. One afternoon, as she adjusted the fuel valve, Riley wheeled in, holding a note. "You got mail." Kayla frowned. "Who from?" "No return address." She opened it. Inside was a single sentence typed in bold letters. "We saw your video. Impressive work. More to come." There was no name, no logo, just that. Kayla looked at Riley. "What video?" He looked sheepish. "I posted the static test fire on a closed engineering forum, just to see. I didn't think—" But Kayla wasn't mad. She just stared at the paper. Someone was watching. Not just mocking, not just criticizing. Someone saw the stars, too. And in that moment, everything she'd gone through, the rejection, the vandalism, the doubt, felt like fuel. Not just for the rocket, but for her. The first real test was scheduled for a Sunday morning just after sunrise. Kayla had picked that time intentionally. Before the town was awake, before curious eyes could question her methods or whisper doubts that she might accidentally blow herself to bits. The air was still heavy with night's chill, and dew clung to the tall grass around the barn like a quiet warning. She stood in the field behind their house, Nova standing proudly on a makeshift launch pad her father had helped her build from cinder blocks and steel rods. The rocket gleamed silver in the dawn light, its nose pointed toward the sky like it already knew the way. Beside her, Ms. Blake reviewed checklists printed on recycled paper, and Riley sat bundled in his wheelchair, a tablet on his lap, ready to record. Her dad stood a few feet away, rubbing his hands together for warmth and maybe also to quiet his nerves. Kayla triple-checked the ignition system, hands steady, despite the pounding in her chest. Wires coiled like vines across the launch pad, all leading to a red button that would either change everything or fizzle into silence. "You ready, Rocket Girl?" Ms. Blake asked, arching a brow. Kayla exhaled. "Ready?" She turned toward Riley. "Camera rolling?" "Rolling." He grinned, teeth chattering. She nodded once more and knelt by the ignition box. The final countdown echoed only inside her own mind. 5, 4, 3, 2. She pressed the button. At first, there was nothing. Then, with a sudden growl, the engine roared to life. A burst of flame exploded downward, crackling like thunder. The rocket trembled, then lifted, slowly, awkwardly at first, then faster, until it cleared the stand and soared 20 feet into the air. The crowd of 4 gasped as Nova climbed, arcing slightly before gravity pulled her back down. She landed with a crunch in a bed of hay Kayla had laid out. Silence. Then an eruption of cheers. Riley shouted, waving his arms in the air. Her dad laughed so loudly it startled the birds from the trees. Ms. Blake clapped her hands together, beaming with pride. Kayla didn't move. She stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes locked on the smoke still lingering in the air. She'd done it. It hadn't been perfect. Nova had veered to the right, and the ignition was a second too late, but she'd launched it. She'd made something fly. As her dad rushed to hug her, lifting her off her feet, Kayla let herself laugh, really laugh. She was shaking, whether from cold or relief she didn't know, but all she could think was, this is what it feels like to lift off. The footage Riley captured went online that evening, not to a public platform, but to the same closed aerospace forum where Kayla's name had already begun to circulate. Within hours, the comments came flooding in. "This is homemade?" That thrust ratio looked solid. "What's her mix?" "Who is she?" Someone even messaged privately, asking if she'd built the telemetry system herself. Kayla stared at the screen in awe. These weren't bullies from school or nosy teachers. These were engineers. People who cared about rockets, who spoke the language she'd taught herself in that creaky barn. And they respected her. The following week at school was different. Not quieter, just changed. She walked through the halls and noticed fewer stares, fewer whispers. A couple of students even nodded as she passed. She wasn't sure if it was respect or just curiosity, but she didn't care. Her rocket had flown. The sky had seen her, but not everyone celebrated. That Thursday, she was called into the main office. She assumed it was about a math test or maybe another lecture about extracurricular safety. But when she walked in, Mr. Warner was waiting, with another man beside him. The man was unfamiliar. He wore a sharp navy blazer and had a folder tucked beneath his arm. His face didn't carry judgment, just interest. "This is Mr. Callahan," Warner said curtly. "He's from the State Education Board." Kayla blinked. "Why?" Mr. Callahan smiled calmly. "We've been made aware of your independent rocketry experiments. Very impressive, by the way. But we just wanted to make sure you're operating within state safety protocols." Kayla's mouth went dry. "Everything I've done is under controlled conditions," she said. "I've studied FAA guidelines. I've stayed under altitude limits and never used restricted materials." Mr. Callahan raised a hand. "I'm not here to shut you down, Miss Morgan. Quite the opposite. I think what you're doing is remarkable. But visibility brings scrutiny. Just be aware." Kayla nodded slowly. "'Kay." As they dismissed her, Mr. Callahan paused at the door. "You should look up the Horizon Scholars Initiative. It's a mentorship program linked with several aerospace institutions. They're always looking for young minds like yours." Back in the barn that night, she told Ms. Blake what had happened. "They're watching now," she said. "Not just the town. People out there. Important people." Ms. Blake smiled faintly. "Then let's give them something worth watching." Over the next month, Kayla built Nova 2. Stronger frame, improved fuel regulation, stabilizer fins she cut from an old satellite dish. Her dad helped weld the test stand to concrete blocks for better anchoring. Riley designed a new tracking algorithm that let them plot altitude on his tablet. But as Nova 2 neared completion, something else began to change. Her dad's cough, which had started weeks ago, grew harsher. He brushed it off, saying it was the cold or dust from the barn. But Kayla saw the way he winced when he stood too fast, how his hands trembled as he passed her tools. One evening, after dinner, she found him sitting on the porch steps, head in his hands. "You okay?" she asked, crouching beside him. He nodded without looking up. "Just tired, sweetheart." Kayla hesitated, then rested her hand on his shoulder. "I can slow down on the rocket if you need help with work. I know you've been covering double shifts." "No," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "You don't slow down for me. Not for anyone. You're doing something bigger than this town, Kayla. Bigger than me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him she'd give it all up if it meant he could rest or be okay. But deep down, she knew he wouldn't let her. And maybe he shouldn't. A week later, Nova 2 launched. The test field was fuller this time. Ms. Blake had quietly told a few colleagues. Riley invited a neighbor who worked at the community college. Even a reporter from the local paper showed up, notebook in hand. Kayla stood before them all, wires in hand, heart racing. "Final checks," she said, her voice strong despite everything. Riley gave a thumbs up. "Telemetry locked in." Ms. Blake whispered, "Fly straight, little star." Kayla pressed the ignition. Nova Duty erupted upward with a sound like thunder. Not just 20 feet this time, but 50, then 70. It climbed clean, with a trail of white smoke and sunlight gleaming off its body. At the apex, a small parachute deployed, just like she'd designed. The crowd burst into applause. She didn't cheer, she didn't cry. She just stood there, watching the sky, hands still raised like she could hold the rocket's path in her palms. Later, the local news ran a headline. "Janitor's daughter sends rocket soaring over Tennessee fields." The article made the rounds. People called it inspiring, humble, gritty. The kind of story small towns love to claim when greatness seems close enough to touch. But Kayla didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the message she got 2 nights later from a man named Dr. Marcus Lee. "Kayla, we've been following your progress. The Horizon Initiative would love to speak with you about your work and your future." She stared at the message on her cracked screen, barely breathing. The stars weren't waiting anymore. They were calling. The day after receiving the message from Dr. Marcus Lee, Kayla barely slept. She kept waking in the middle of the night, blinking at the cracked ceiling above her bed, wondering if it had been a dream. She reread the email at least a dozen times, each word echoing like thunder in her chest. "We've been following your progress. We'd love to speak with you about your work and your future, her future." That word had always felt like a distant planet, something she aimed for but couldn't quite reach. Now, it felt like the rocket wasn't the only thing that had launched. She had, too. Still, excitement quickly tangled with anxiety. What if it was a mistake? What if they thought she was someone else? What if, when they met her, they realized she was just a girl from Tennessee with engine oil on her jeans and no formal training beyond YouTube videos and borrowed books? The following morning, Ms. Blake sat across from Kayla in the barn, sipping coffee from her usual thermos. She listened as Kayla nervously read the email out loud again, her voice wavering slightly on the word future. "They wouldn't reach out if they weren't serious," Ms. Blake said. "Marcus Lee doesn't waste time. He's one of the best propulsion minds in the country." Kayla blinked. Wait, the Marcus Lee? The one who designed the arc jet system for the Orion capsule? "The very same," Ms. Blake nodded. "I met him once. Brilliant, a little intense." Kayla's stomach twisted. "So, what do I say?" "Tell them your story," Ms. Blake said gently. "You don't need to dress it up. You're already doing the kind of work some grad students dream about. Just be you." A few days later, Kayla sat on a video call in the school library. Ms. Blake had pulled strings to get her access to a quiet room and a decent connection. The screen loaded, and there he was. Dr. Marcus Lee, surrounded by blueprints, whiteboards, and the unmistakable background hum of a NASA office. His face was calm but sharp-eyed, like he could see through everything and still choose to believe in it. "Kayla Morgan," he said, smiling. "I've been waiting to meet you." Kayla swallowed. "Hi, sir. Thanks for reaching out." "Of course," he said, folding his hands. "I watched both of your test videos. Impressive work. Your launch data was clean, your engine configuration was elegant, and your tracking system, designed by your little brother, I believe, was creative. Tell me, how long have you been building?" Kayla took a deep breath. "Since I was 7, but seriously, a little over a year. And where'd you learn all this?" "The library. Some online courses. A lot of trial and error," and Ms. Blake, She used to work at NASA. She's been helping." Dr. Lee nodded, clearly pleased. "We value resourcefulness at Horizon. Innovation born from necessity. You embody that. We'd like to invite you to participate in our summer mentorship program." Kayla froze. She thought maybe he'd say he was just interested, or wanted to talk more, or maybe connect her with someone. But this was more. This was real. "It's based in Houston," he continued. "You'll work alongside our junior engineers. Design, simulate, even run a few supervised tests. It's rigorous, but I think you're ready." Kayla blinked hard, trying to keep her emotions from spilling over. I'd love to." Dr. Lee smiled again. "We'll send you the official invitation and a stipend to cover travel and housing. See you in June, Kayla." When the call ended, Kayla sat in stunned silence for a full minute. Then she let out a scream that startled a passing teacher and sprinted all the way to the barn to tell her dad. He was sitting on the porch, a warm cloth pressed to his temple, a bottle of cold medicine beside him. He looked up when she ran over, breathless and beaming. "They want me, Dad," she said. "NASA. Dr. Marcus Lee. I got in." David Morgan's eyes widened, then softened. He reached out, pulled her into his arms, and held her tightly. "I knew it," he whispered into her hair. "I knew it, baby girl." But even as he smiled, Kayla could feel the tremor in his arms, the weight in his breath. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she found herself in the barn again, standing beside Nova 2. It still bore the scars of its launch, the charred base, the dented stabilizer where it had landed, but to her it was beautiful. It was proof. She ran her hand along its side, thinking of Houston, of working with real engineers, of seeing the inside of an actual spacecraft lab, but her thoughts kept circling back to her dad. The cough had worsened. The fatigue wasn't going away. He tried to hide it, but she'd seen him drop a mug the other morning, his hands too unsteady. He was fading, slowly, like an engine losing thrust. The next week, her world began to split in two. Half of her prepared for Houston. She applied for a student travel grant, filled out forms, and ordered supplies with the help of a local charity that had heard her story in the paper. The other half of her walked on eggshells at home, watching her father sleep longer, eat less, and pretend it was just seasonal junk. One afternoon, while helping Riley with a school project, Kayla heard her dad collapse in the kitchen. She raced in, panic burning her throat. He was conscious but pale, his breath labored. The ER visit confirmed what she feared but hadn't dared say out loud. Early-stage pulmonary fibrosis. The doctors said it had likely developed from years of chemical exposure at work. Cleaning agents, bleach, dust, time. They didn't say it, but Kayla could hear what they were really telling her. It would get worse. And there was no cure. In the car ride home, the silence was heavier than gravity. Kayla stared out the window, her fists clenched. "I don't want to leave you," she whispered. Her dad chuckled, a rasp in his throat. "You're not leaving me. You're chasing your stars." She shook her head. "What if something happens while I'm gone? What if you get worse?" He turned to her slowly, eyes glassy but firm. "If you stay here for me, I'll get worse anyway. Because I'll know I held you back." Tears streamed down her face. "I don't care about rockets as much as I care about you." He reached over, squeezed her hand. "Then prove that what I've worked for wasn't in vain. You go, Kayla. You shine. I'll be right here, watching." The night before she left for Houston, the entire town came to the barn. Pete from the junkyard brought a set of custom wrenches, Ms. Blake baked a pie. Even Jared, the boy who once made fun of her, showed up with a card signed by half the sophomore class. And when it was time to go, her dad handed her a small, worn notebook. "I found this in your room, your first rocket sketches. I saved it." She opened it, and on the inside cover he'd written, "To my daughter, who was never meant to stay on the ground." At the bus stop, as she hugged Riley and held her dad just a second longer than necessary, she whispered, "I'll come back. I promise." "I'll be here," he whispered, "always." And with that she boarded the bus, backpack strapped tight, heart thundering. The road ahead stretched far and wide, but she was no longer afraid. The stars were waiting, and now she was ready to meet them. Houston was nothing like Willow Creek. The air was thicker, the buildings impossibly tall, and the sky seemed to shimmer with heat instead of stars. Kayla stepped off the bus, gripping the straps of her worn backpack, trying to steady the flutter in her chest. Everything about this place screamed faster, brighter, bigger. The sidewalks buzzed with people in lab coats and sleek suits. Even the clouds moved differently, like they had somewhere important to be. Her first glimpse of the Johnson Space Center took her breath away. A giant steel arch welcomed visitors. Inside, models of spacecraft hung from the ceilings, and glass walls framed exhibits of Mars rovers, cryogenic tanks, and sleek prototypes that felt like they belonged in science fiction. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. This was where minds like hers belonged, if she could prove she deserved it. The Horizon summer program assigned her to Dorm C, a quiet corner of the facility reserved for visiting students. Her roommate, Ivy, was a soft-spoken robotics prodigy from Oregon who greeted her with a shy wave and a desk already covered in miniature servo motors. Most of the other mentees had stories similar to Ivy's: private schools, science fair trophies, internships at companies Kayla had only read about. She felt the gap immediately. She didn't talk like them, didn't have the same vocabulary, didn't casually reference advanced software programs or competitions with acronyms she barely understood. During orientation, when they went around the room introducing themselves, she simply said, "I'm Kayla. I like building rockets," and left it at that. But something shifted during the first workshop. They were divided into teams to design a small, reusable landing module using limited materials. Kayla's team started out rocky. No one knew what to do with the girl who didn't have AP Physics on her resume. But when the propulsion equation didn't balance and even the most confident kid couldn't figure out why, Kayla picked up a marker and, without hesitation, corrected the burn time calculation in one clean step. "Wait," said one of the boys, staring at the whiteboard. "That actually makes sense." Kayla shrugged. "Your math was solid, but you forgot to factor in mass loss during ejection." The room went quiet. From that moment on, they listened. Over the next 2 weeks, Kayla found her rhythm. She woke early to review blueprints, stayed late in the labs to run simulations. Her hands were always smudged with graphite and her shirt pockets stuffed with notes. She asked questions constantly, sometimes too many, but the engineers appreciated her curiosity. She wasn't trying to sound smart. She just wanted to understand. Dr. Marcus Lee became a regular visitor to her project station. He didn't hover or offer praise, but every now and then he would watch her work with a thoughtful expression, then ask one pointed question that made her rethink everything. She came to appreciate those moments. They sharpened her. But the adjustment wasn't all triumphs. One afternoon, during a high-pressure test of a composite engine casing, the material cracked under load and the test chamber buckled. No one was hurt, but Kayla took it hard. She replayed the failure again and again, certain she'd made a mistake in her thickness ratio. That evening, she skipped dinner and sat alone in the practice hangar, staring at the remnants of her design. She didn't hear footsteps until someone sat beside her. It was Ivy. "Hey," she said gently. "You okay?" Kayla shook her head. "I thought I had it. I triple-checked everything." "Sometimes even perfect math can't predict real-world behavior," Ivy said. "That's why they call it testing, not proving." Kayla laughed, but it caught in her throat. "I feel like I don't belong here," she admitted. "Everyone else talks like they were born in a lab. I'm just me, a girl from Tennessee who learned rocketry from library books and engine parts." Ivy looked at her, eyes steady. "And yet, here you are, building engines and correcting burn rates faster than half the grad students I know. You belong, Kayla, more than you think." The next day, Kayla was back in the lab. She redesigned the casing. this time using a different structural rib configuration based on something she remembered from a rusted bicycle frame back home. Her new model didn't just pass the pressure test, it exceeded it. Dr. Lee raised an eyebrow and nodded once, the closest thing to a standing ovation in NASA engineering. Still, even as Kayla soared, part of her heart remained tethered to home. She called Riley every night. He updated her on everything, how their dad was doing, how Ms. Blake had started teaching a free STEM class in the barn, how the town had raised enough money to patch their roof. But as the days passed, Riley's voice grew more careful, slower. "How's Dad?" Kayla asked one night, pacing her dorm room. There was a pause. "He's tired," Riley said. "Won't say it, but he's coughing more. And he sleeps a lot. But he's proud of you, Kayla. So proud." She sat down hard on the bed, her heart sinking. "I wish I could be there." "You are," Riley said. "Every time I look at the sky, I know you're chasing it for all of us." Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't afford to crack. Not here. The final week of the program culminated in a team presentation. Each group had to pitch a new aerospace concept using both practical models and theoretical analysis. Kayla's team worked on a vertical takeoff and a landing system designed for Mars terrain. It was ambitious, borderline impossible, but Kayla loved every minute of it. They built a scale prototype with adjustable landing struts, and Kayla led the simulation team. Her design saved weight by embedding shock absorption into the main fuel structure, a concept that Dr. Lee later told her mirrored something NASA had explored only in theory. Presentation day arrived, and Kayla stood at the front of a large conference room, her voice steady, her gestures confident. When questions came, she answered them without hesitation, even challenging a senior engineer's assumption about Martian wind shear. Laughter rippled through the audience when the engineer conceded, "She's right. I stand corrected." At the end of the day, Dr. Lee approached her in the hallway. "You've done excellent work," he said. "You have the mind of a builder and the heart of a pioneer." Kayla flushed. "Thank you, sir." "I want you to consider applying to the advanced mentorship program next year," he said. "It's tougher, longer, and more selective, but I think you're ready." Kayla's heart skipped. "I'll do it," he smiled. "Good. And Kayla? Yes? Don't forget where you came from, but don't let it define your ceiling." Later that night, Kayla sat on the roof outside the dorm window, watching the stars blink above Houston's skyline. The air was thick, the ground far below, but the stars, they felt the same as they did back home. Distant, beautiful, waiting. She pulled out the notebook her dad had given her and opened to a blank page. At the top, she wrote, "Next, design a vessel not just for flight, but for return." Because she knew now, it wasn't just about going up, it was about bringing something back. For her father, for Riley, for every kid who thought the stars were too far. And somewhere in that silent night, with the hum of NASA still buzzing below her feet, Kayla Morgan began dreaming again. Not just of rockets, but of legacy. When Kayla stepped off the return bus in Willow Creek, her heart felt heavier than the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The 2 months in Houston had transformed her, polished her thinking, sharpened her problem-solving, deepened her confidence. But it had also peeled back layers of childhood she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She was still just 16, and yet she felt years older. She had stood in front of NASA engineers and held her ground, debated theoretical propulsion models with PhDs, and led simulations that had once seemed like unreachable dreams. Now, she was back in a town where the post office still closed at noon on Sundays. The familiar gravel crunched under her boots as she made her way up the dirt path to the house. The barn came into view first, her barn. The constellation mural she had painted over the hateful graffiti still shimmered in the sunlight, a quiet declaration of resilience. A small metal weather vane, shaped like a rocket ship, spun lazily at the roof's edge. She smiled, but her smile faded when she reached the porch. Her father was there, waiting, smiling, but he was thinner, paler, The lines on his face had deepened. His once sturdy shoulders now sagged slightly, like gravity had grown stronger in his absence. "Hey, Rocket Girl," he said, voice raspy. Kayla dropped her bag and fell into his arms. He hugged her tightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Inside, Riley had decorated the kitchen with a homemade banner, "Welcome home, Kayla." He rolled in from the hallway with a grin so wide it made Kayla's heart ache. "We made your favorite," he said. "Mac and cheese. The good kind, with breadcrumbs." Kayla laughed. "You spoil me." Dinner was warm and familiar, filled with shared stories. Her dad listened intently as she recounted her work on the Mars lander simulation, how she'd fixed a flawed design by borrowing from old motorcycle suspension systems. "I knew it," he said, pride burning behind tired eyes. "You're going to change the world." That night, after Riley had gone to bed, Kayla and her father sat on the porch in silence. The stars above Willow Creek looked closer than ever. Kayla leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the sky. "Of what?" "Of losing you. Of all of this meaning nothing if you're not around to see it." He took her hand gently. "You know, when your mom got sick, I used to sit on this porch and pray you'd grow up strong, brave. Not just smart, but kind. Someone who'd keep going, even when it hurt." He paused. "You've done more than I ever dreamed, Kayla. And I've seen it. I've felt it." Kayla blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. "You keep chasing those stars," he said. "I'll be here as long as I can, but even when I'm not, I'll still be watching." She couldn't speak, so she just nodded. The next day, Kayla visited the barn. It smelled of oil and wood and sunlight. Her tools were just where she'd left them, though the cobwebs had claimed the corners. She walked to her workbench and pulled out her notebook. The last thing she had written in Houston still stared up at her. Design a vessel not just for flight, but for return. She flipped to a fresh page and began sketching. Over the following weeks, Kayla threw herself into her work, not just with rockets, but with the community. Inspired by her experience in the Horizon program, she started a weekly workshop in the barn, inviting local kids to learn the basics of engineering. At first, only a few showed up, most of them curious rather than committed. But by the end of the month, the barn buzzed every Saturday morning with laughter, questions, and the whir of 3D printed parts. Ms. Blake returned too, no longer just a mentor, but a co-teacher. She brought soldering kits and safety goggles, circuits, and capacitors. Together, they built a curriculum that could turn rusty minds into dreaming ones. Kayla even brought Riley into the fold. He began teaching the younger kids how to code simple programs using open-source robotics kits, and it wasn't long before the students were calling him Professor Riley. The energy in the barn was contagious. But even amid the joy and activity, Kayla noticed the signs. Her father coughed more often. He took longer to climb the stairs. Some days, he didn't leave bed until the sun was high. One afternoon, she found him asleep in the recliner with an old photo album resting on his chest. She sat beside him and flipped through the pages. Pictures of her as a baby, holding wrenches before dolls, Riley in his early years, her mother's soft smile in the background of almost every photo. "I'm not ready," Kayla whispered aloud. Her father stirred, opened his eyes slowly. "You don't have to be. No one ever is." In late October, she received an official invitation to apply for the Advanced Horizon Mentorship, a full-year program that included satellite lab access, field simulations, and potential placement for future co-op roles at NASA. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. But the start date was March. She stared at the offer for hours. When she told her father, he squeezed her hand weakly. "You're going," he said. "We'll figure it out." "I don't want to miss time with you," she said. "Then don't," he replied. "Be here now, but go when it's time." So she did. For the next 4 months, she was present. She cooked dinner when her father was too tired, took Riley on drives down empty back roads just to see him laugh. She worked with the kids in the barn, built a rocket engine from reclaimed tractor parts, and on her father's good days, she brought him to the shed and showed him her progress. One day, she wheeled a completed model into the backyard and said, "This one's for you." It wasn't built for altitude or distance. It was built for showing up, for the fire, for the sound, for the pride on his face. When she launched it, the engine lit beautifully. It soared 30 feet into the blue and landed softly on the grass. Her father clapped weakly, tears streaming down his face. "Perfect," he whispered. On February 28th, David Morgan passed away in his sleep. Kayla sat with him for hours after the paramedics left. She held his hand and reread the note he had once written in her sketchbook. "To my daughter, who was never meant to stay on the ground." At the funeral, half the town showed up. Ms. Blake gave the eulogy. Riley read a poem, and Kayla, voice steady, stood before everyone and said, "My father cleaned floors and repaired windows. He raised 2 kids by himself. But more than anything, he believed. In people, in dreams, in me. And because of that, I will never stop reaching for the stars." 2 weeks later, she packed her things and boarded a train to Houston. She left the house keys with Ms. Blake, the barn open for the kids, and a small plaque mounted above the doorway. It read, "The David Morgan Learning Shed, where dreams don't care where you come from." Kayla stared out the window as the town disappeared behind her. Her heart ached with loss, but it pulsed with purpose. She wasn't flying away. She was returning, carrying everything with her. The stars would see her coming. The moment Kayla stepped off the train in Houston, it felt different than the first time. The city's towering skyline no longer overwhelmed her. The buzz of cars, the chatter of people, the sterile white walls of the Johnson Space Center, they were no longer foreign. They felt like a second language, familiar, understandable. This time, she wasn't just visiting. She was returning. The Advanced Horizon Mentorship Program felt like stepping onto a rocket mid-ascent. Everything moved faster. The projects were more complex, the simulations more demanding, and the stakes higher. Kayla was one of only 15 students selected nationwide. Most of them were already dual-enrolled in elite college programs or had competed in international engineering competitions. She was the only one whose application came from a high school in rural Tennessee, and the only one who had built a functioning rocket from junkyard parts. In the early days of the program, she felt the pressure mount. They were tasked with developing a prototype for an adaptive guidance system, one that could correct its trajectory mid-flight without relying on traditional GPS. It was a problem NASA had struggled with for years in low-visibility conditions. The challenge left some of the students hesitant. Others threw out textbook solutions that failed in real-world scenarios. Kayla watched, listened, and thought. She remembered something her father used to say when fixing old lawnmowers. "If it can't talk to you, make it feel." It echoed in her mind as she stared at their lab's whiteboard filled with equations that weren't working. Instead of solving the problem through overcomplicated software, Kayla proposed a mechanical solution, a hybrid system that would respond to magnetic flux changes in the environment. Old-school principles used in new ways. At first, her teammates were skeptical, but once she built a tiny demo with wire coils, magnets, and a 3D printed pivot, and it responded perfectly to directional shifts in the test chamber, they started paying attention. By the end of the week, her design was leading the pack. Dr. Marcus Lee watched her from the observation gallery and made no effort to hide his approval. "I believe we've found our North Star," he said to one of the mentors, but the spotlight brought new challenges. One evening, Kayla overheard 2 students, Jason and Amara, whispering in the cafeteria. "She's good," Jason said, "but come on, it's a sympathy story. The girl from nowhere, junkyard rocket, dead dad, they eat that stuff up." "She's smart," Amara said, "just not like us." Kayla didn't confront them. She didn't need to. She knew the truth. She was not like them, and that was her power. She was forged in oil-stained notebooks, not computer labs. Her calculations were sharpened by necessity, not theory. While they debated, she built, and build she did. Over the next 2 months, her adaptive guidance prototype didn't just work, it excelled. It surpassed the benchmark for correction accuracy by 12% and maintained stability even during artificial turbulence simulations. She was invited to present it at the Youth Aerospace Expo, a nationally recognized conference held at Cape Canaveral. Her name appeared in the event flyer. Her photo, smiling, sleeves rolled up, a graphite streak across her cheek, was posted on Horizon's website under the caption, "Innovation from the ground up." She should have felt triumphant. Instead, all she could think about was her father. He would have loved this. He would have driven the distance, even in his old truck with the faulty ignition, just to sit in the back row and cheer louder than anyone else. The night before her presentation, Kayla sat alone in her temporary dorm room, flipping through the pages of her old notebook. Inside were equations written in the margins, crinkled photos of Nova 2, and at the very back, a tiny, folded piece of paper. It was her dad's handwriting. "Keep your eyes on the stars, but your hands on the tools." She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. The next morning, dressed in her black Horizon jumpsuit with her name embroidered across the chest, Kayla stepped onto the stage in front of hundreds of industry professionals, scientists, and students. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She spoke with clarity, passion, and precision. She explained how her adaptive guidance system was inspired not by textbooks, but by watching birds adjust their wings mid-flight to follow magnetic fields. She showed the progression of her prototypes, from rusted scrap to polished titanium. She answered every question with the confidence of someone who hadn't just studied engineering, but lived it. When she finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Dr. Lee caught her eye from the front row and nodded, a subtle but powerful gesture of respect. After the presentation, people lined up to speak with her. Professors from MIT, engineers from Lockheed Martin, a representative from JPL. They all wanted to know more about the girl from Willow Creek. The girl who turned grief into innovation. Who built not just rockets, but belief. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon at Cape Canaveral, casting long shadows across the launch pads in the distance, Kayla stood alone by the water. She held her phone, fingers hovering over Riley's contact. When he picked up, his voice was chipper. "Did you blow their minds?" She laughed. "Kinda. I think Dad would have fainted." Riley was quiet for a beat. "He would have been front row, crying and clapping like an idiot." "I miss him so much," Kayla said. "Me too," Riley whispered. "But Kayla, he's in this. In everything you're doing. In the circuits. In the solder. In the way you never back down." She wiped her eyes. "I got invited to join the Lunar Ascent simulation team this summer. It's huge." "You're gonna do it, right?" "I am," she said. "And someday, when they send someone to Mars, I want a part of that ship to be mine." "You'll do more than that," he said. "You'll change where the sky begins." When she returned to Willow Creek that spring, everything had changed, yet everything remained. The roads were still dusty, the porch still creaked, the barn still smelled of sun and rust. But now, kids lined up every Saturday, holding notebooks and half-built drones. Ms. Blake had turned the barn into a full-blown community makerspace. They called it the Launch Lab. Kayla walked in and all the kids stopped and turned to stare. "Is it true?" a little boy asked. "You flew a real rocket in Florida?" She knelt beside him. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." He grinned. "Can I fly one too?" "You can build one better," she said. That night, she sat on the roof, Riley beside her in his chair. The stars were out in full. She opened her notebook, now half filled with new schematics. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "Project Legacy, a rocket powered by small-town dreams and big-hearted people." She closed the notebook and looked up. The stars no longer seemed far away. They were hers now, and she was never coming back down. Kayla Morgan's story teaches us that brilliance isn't born in privilege. It's forged in persistence. She didn't have fancy equipment, expensive tutors, or a classroom lined with cutting-edge technology. What she had was grit, a relentless spirit, and a father who believed in her even when the world didn't. Her journey reminds us that it doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is how fiercely you believe in your dreams, and how far you're willing to go to chase them. Even when Kayla was overlooked, doubted, or mocked, she chose resilience over resentment. She didn't wait for the world to open its doors. She built her own. She failed. She stumbled, but every setback became fuel. And when life gave her pain, she transformed it into purpose. Most importantly, Kayla never forgot her roots. She proved that chasing the stars doesn't mean leaving your community behind. It means lighting the way for others. Her story is a powerful reminder. With enough determination, a little imagination, and a whole lot of heart, we are all capable of flight. Now, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next incredible story that touches the heart and inspires the soul. See you in the next video!